So for learning outcome 5, my task was to outline the constructive nature of memory. I thought I would first start off by giving the definition of the term constructive nature of memory. So the constructive nature of memory is the idea that what people report as memories are constructed based on what actually happened plus additional factors, such as expectations, other knowledge, or personal knowledge, and other life experiences. One aspect of the constructive nature of memory is illustrated by the phenomenon of source monitoring. Source monitoring is the process by which people determine the origins of memories, knowledge, or beliefs. Remembering that you heard something from a particular person would be an example of source monitoring. So for me, an example of this could be remembering that I heard about the dangers of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War from my grandfather, who served in the Marines during that time. Source monitoring error occurs when we misidentify the source of a memory. An example of this would be me remembering that Agent Orange was dangerous from my grandfather, but I had really heard about it from a documentary on the Vietnam War. This is also called source misattribution because the memory is attributed to the wrong source. Source monitoring errors are very common, and one of the more sensational cases of source monitoring error is cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is the unconscious plagiarism of the work of others. So the textbook gave an example of the Beatles member George Harrison plagiarizing a tune that was from a different song that he unconsciously remembered and used in his own song. He was sued by the other owners of the same tune, and they won. An example that I think of this could be Melania Trump giving a speech that was unconsciously plagiarized from the work or previous speeches of Michelle Obama. Another concept that illustrates the constructive nature of memory is the illusory truth effect. This is the enhanced probability of evaluating a statement as being true upon repeated presentation. An example of this would be reading online that Rihanna is releasing another album, and despite this being false, you read it again somewhere else and believe it to be true. This is an example of the repetition having an effect on your memory and believing things to be true. The more you read something, the more likely you are to believe it as true. A possible reason why repetition increases perceived truthfulness is because of fluency. Fluency is the ease with which a statement can be remembered. So it's something as quickly as remembering that cats have 4 legs. Something quick that you're easy to remember, that you can access from an existing schema in your mind. Knowledge stored in memory is important, but fluency or familiarity can affect judgments in memory as well. Our knowledge of the world affects our memory, and an example of this is the War of the Ghosts experiment, where researcher Bartlett had participants read a story from Canadian folklore and then asked him to recall it as accurately as possible. He then used repeated reproduction to get the participants to try and remember the story at longer and longer intervals after they first read it. So this means that he had the participants try to recall the story right after they heard it. And then a duration of time passed, and he asked them to recall the story again. And another duration of time passed, and he asked them to recall the story again. And so the participants ended up putting the story in their own words, in this process of him having them repeat the story over and over again is an example of repeated reproduction. The errors the participants made during the reproduction of the story is significant because most of the participants' reproductions of the story were shorter than the original and contained many omissions and inaccuracies. The participants also remembered the story as reflected in their own cultures rather than the culture of the original story. So an example of this would be the story had used the term canoes, and Edwardian English people, when they recalled the story, instead of using the term canoes, they used the term boats. So they translated it in a way that reflected their own culture, and I believe this makes it easier to remember the story later. By translating things into the ways we remember it, we're able to now recall that information for later. I think this is the significance of being able to provide examples of important terms and concepts when you're in school. By being able to do that, you're able to recall the information easier. A schema is a person's knowledge about some aspect of the environment. Schemas influence a person's memory, and we develop schemas through our experiences in different situations. So as previously stated, an example of a schema could be, I see an animal with 4 legs, so I'm going to put it in my brain that it is a cat or a dog because the animal walks on 4 legs and may be domestic. My schema of a cat would be something that has 4 legs, claws, a tail, short ears, and fur. So pretty much a schema is how your brain remembers something to be something. If I see something outside with 4 wheels and a steering wheel and an engine and a trunk and a hood, I'm going to put this in my schema as a car because that's what my mind's schema of a car is. It's something with 4 wheels and a steering wheel and a trunk and a hood. And so usually when I see something outside of that schema, my existing schema of what a car is, I have to now assimilate or accommodate that information so that it fits my schema, or I have to create a new schema if it's a new item. A script is our conception of the sequence of actions that usually occurs during a particular experience. An example of a script would be you walking to class, taking your seat, and pulling out your notes. These other events usually follow the process of going to class. Another example of a script that the textbook gave would be going to a coffee shop. You go to a coffee shop, you wait in line, you put in your order, you pay, and then you pick up your order and leave the shop. So it's pretty much how you expect something to go based on where you are or the experience that you're going through, if that makes sense. So that concludes my description of learning outcome number 5 when I was told to outline the constructive memory of nature. Thank you for listening.